In this video demonstration, we're going to talk about surface preparation. Specifically, we're going to gesso our paper that we'll be utilizing for our first few assignments. I'm actually using a low adhesive tape, something that you can get at Hobby Lobby locally in Kokomo. And the nice thing about using low adhesive tape is once you remove it, it's less likely to tear your paper. I should also mention I'm not using Bristol paper, I am using watercolor paper, but it has kind of a similar amount of weight that it shouldn't really be an issue. If you don't want to invest in low adhesive tape, one of the other things that you can do is you can take any sort of painter's tape and essentially just reduce the stickiness by putting that piece of tape onto your pant leg or your shirt and removing it, and that will essentially kind of reduce its tackiness. I'm putting my first coat of gesso onto my paper. This is just white acrylic paint. It dries pretty quickly. What I'm doing at the moment is I'm just kind of removing some of the excess along the edges, and I'm taking a hair dryer in order to speed up the drying time. The nice thing about acrylic paint is it's water-based. Same thing with acrylic gesso. And so if you use a hair dryer, you can actually speed up the drying time. I will apply essentially 3 coats for this demonstration. And the reason why we prime our surfaces with gesso is to essentially prevent the binder, and in this case, the oil, from leaching out of our paint film and being absorbed into the paper or the substrate. So in this example, you can see on the backside of these drawdowns where that linseed oil has leached out and is now absorbed into the fibers of the paper. That will over time actually deteriorate the paint film and cause the paint to actually flake off because the binder is what holds it together. And so this is why we prime our surfaces with gesso. And for your Bristol paper, you could probably get away with just doing 1 coat of gesso. I'm doing 3 coats at the moment. That's just something that I kind of prefer. I think sometimes it helps the paint adhere just a little bit better. And I'm also allowing this whole process to be played through. I sped it up a lot, but I want you guys to recognize that there's a lot of labor that goes into the process of making paintings. This is kind of the unglamorous part of image making. It's the prep work. And so we kind of just mainly focus on the act of painting, but I think it's important to recognize how much time goes into this step. Now, the last thing that I'm doing right here is I'm making sure that my gessoed piece of paper is square with the edges of my board. So that way, when I start painting, everything is already all level. And I'm finally going in and putting in my last little marks for the 1-inch squares. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually mix up our 7 swatches to create our value scale. I'm using lamp black and titanium white, and this is sped up quite a bit. I think it's maybe at 800%. And so I'm trying to get a nice middle value that I think is a close approximation to being the halfway point between white and black. And the nice thing is if I make a big batch of this middle value, well, then I can kind of use that as also a foundation for the other mixtures, whether I'm going a little bit lighter or I'm going a little bit darker. And so it's in my best interest to kind of make up a little bit more of that middle value from the beginning. So the nice thing about oil paint is it doesn't dry quickly. So I actually have a long open period in which I can manipulate it to kind of fine tune these mixtures. I would encourage that you do a lot of your initial thinking on the palette first before you jump in to working on your canvas, your panel, or your piece of paper. Now, for anyone that has worked with acrylic dries really quickly, which prevents you from the opportunity to really kind of fine tune your mixtures on the palette. And I'm using a wood palette. I like a wood palette. That's what I'm going to probably use throughout most of the semester. For this class, I recommended that everyone get an old picture frame because it'll make your life maybe a little bit easier in terms of cleanup. Because with a glass surface, you can use a razor. Can't really do that on wood. So I'm just going through and fine-tuning my mixtures with my palette knife, and I think I'm just about where I need to be. I kind of realized towards the end where I thought that everything could be more or less shifted just a little bit brighter in value. And so here is a photograph of my finished mixtures that I will kind of use as the basis for my value scale. So I'm going to apply these mixtures going from the brightest value, so pure white, to the darkest value. And by going in this direction, it allows me to not have to clean my brush as obsessively. Because if I went from the darkest value to, pure white, well, I'm probably going to have a little bit. It's not going to be that much, but just a little bit of paint left over on my brush that would ultimately compromise my pure white swatch and kind of bring down its value just a little bit. I should mention that my memory card filled up, and so that's why there was a little bit of a jump there, but I think you get the gist of it. I'm more or less just applying those swatches. And the one thing that you should kind of keep in mind is I put the first swatch down of the pure white and then the second one right next to it, and I was like thinking immediately, oh man, this is going to look way too dark. That's too big of a jump. If you have that same kind of feeling or sensation, just wait before you make an overcorrection. Because I felt like once I put down all of the other swatches in order, it actually seemed fairly consistent and gradual for my 7-step value scale. However, if you get to the end and you feel like things are inconsistent, make the change. That's fine. So the next thing I'm going to show is, well, what do we do when we're done? And this might be a bit of a trigger for some of you, but we essentially just wipe off our palette. I took my palette knife and a rag and I essentially scooped up all the excess paint and I toss it into the garbage. And I will then take another rag with some solvent on it and wipe off the rest of the paint that was on the palette. And it should be pretty good. Now, I have to do this right away with a wood palette. If you're using a glass surface, you have a little bit more leniency because you could always use a scraper at the end. Now, we're going to talk about cleaning our brushes. So, this is our little container. As I mentioned, we have this little grate down at the bottom that if we're cleaning our brushes, what this is going to do is it's essentially going to knock some of those paint particulates that are in between the bristles, and it's going to filter down between those holes and kind of clump up into this goop. It's kind of gross. But by having that little grate in between, we will usually never actually interact with that goop at the bottom. So here's just a top-down view. If I'm cleaning my brush and I have my little canteen, I just kind of mix it in there. That grate down at the bottom is knocking off any of the paint particulates, and I essentially just wipe off the excess of the solvent onto another shop towel or used rag or something of that sort to kind of get some of the excess off. And I will also sometimes put the bristles in between my fingers in order to kind of massage some of the excess paint away if I feel like it's still within the bristles. So that pretty much does a pretty good job of cleaning it. As I will mention in class, I will also kind of finish things up by using saliva on my bristles. The last thing is you close your canteen and you're good to go. So that should be it.